Part 1. End of an Era. Chapter 1. Neill. The Purple and Green. The clouds parted and a beam of sunlight lit up the sky with a burst of color that silhouetted the dark shapes in the sky. Dragons soared leisurely around Mount Hamel, calling out to each other as they twisted and danced in the cool mountain air. I would never grow tired of seeing dragons free. Unfortunately, that wasn't why I was here. The small blot on the landscape down below became a figure on a horse, moving fast, surrounded by its own trail of flying dust and scattering rocks. The wall scouts atop the Draconis Monastery where I now stood had seen the shape not a quarter of a watch ago and summoned me to make a decision about it. "Do we let them in?" At my side, Lilipenna screwed her eyes against the sun's high glare. She had grown both in height and stature, it seemed to me. Or maybe it was that the yoke of the old Draconis order had been thrown from her shoulders, and she could stand tall, no longer burdened with the cruelties thrown at her because of her skin color, her gender, and her pirate heritage. Gone were the heavy, cumbersome black robes of the order, and gone were the silly cloth and leather sandals that had done nothing to protect our feet from the chills of the towering Mount Hamel. Instead, Lilla, like me and all the other students who still lived here at the monastery, had reverted to donning part robes and far sturdier attire we were all more used to wearing. Lilla wore the leather cuirass that she had arrived at the monastery with, along with her bright orange headband, and her boots were now the reinforced interwoven leather greaves most of us wore. "I've got him," Lilla murmured, sighting down the short bow that she held straight toward the rushing figure. "Wait, Lilla, let's hear what he has to say first," I said uneasily. It had been a little more than a moon cycle since we had taken the monastery from Abbot Ansall and the other monks who'd willingly followed him in the culling and sacrifice of dragons for his own end. The Draconis Monastery still stood, in part, but the Draconis Order was no more. With the disappearance of Abbot Ansall and his most loyal followers, the remaining monks left here had wandered in a sort of daze for the first week or so. They asked each other the same questions over and over. What do we do? What are we supposed to do? Why are we here at all if not to control the dragons? I didn't have answers for them. Not yet. Everything was still in chaos. The wall that had collapsed on the golden bull Zaxx was still down, though we had managed to convince one of the great whites to shift and nose the masonry blocks into a rough and disheveled embankment where the wall had once stood. The tunnel through which Zaxx had wormed his way and escaped was still a visible sinkhole on the other side, and every time I caught sight of it, I shuddered. Another thing to worry about as I watched the rider approach. "He could be anyone from anywhere. It could be the abbot come back to try and mesmerize and curse us again," Lilla growled. "Don't forget what happened to Brother Fyodor." Lilla kept her bowstring taut. "Lilla," I admonished her. When I closed my eyes, I could still see the terrible sight of Fyodor, one of the few actual dragon monks here, aside from Jodrith, whom I actually liked and could call a friend, fried to a crisp by the abbot, all for having the temerity to defy him. Burying Fyodor had been one of my first priorities, and the ceremony had been short, awkward, and gray. This was not the sort of future I wanted for this place. Since taking over, our time had been spent dealing with worries, funerals, and arguments between the remnants of the original Draconis Order monks who had stayed behind and us students who were trying to work out what we were doing. Of all the students here, I probably had the most strategic experience, thanks to my father's tutelage. I relied on my knowledge of being a son of Torvald, which was why Lilla had called me, here and now, to deal with this fast-approaching rider. "We haven't had anyone visit the monastery since," I said under my breath, my heart hammering as the figure approached. It felt in my heart that it wasn't just one person on a horse, but a storm. "I know we haven't. It could be anyone. It could be a message from Prince Vincent, from Shar's father, the Northern Kingdom Prince, or even from Ansall himself, Lilla said, as two more of our ad hoc wall guards appeared. The tall and broad Terence, son of Prince Griffith, the Prince of the Southern Kingdom, and surprisingly Dorf Lesser, my much smaller friend and one-time roommate. They each carried short swords and spears, with Terence looking as regal and as comfortable as his father, and Dorf looking slightly ridiculous in the helmet that didn't fit and an oversized shield strapped to his back that made him look like a turtle. "Terence," I nodded, greeting my once rival. Like Lilla, the nobleman's son had changed in the short months since the wall fell. When he had seen the abbot's complete betrayal and lack of respect for the students and dragons, Terence became quieter, less disruptive, and ready to acknowledge our new way of working with the mighty beasts was an improvement. "Torvald?" Torrance nodded back, still managing to inflect a little bit of that sarcasm he always had when referring to my warlord family status. Then he grinned, showing that he had accepted he had to work with non-nobles like me, Dorf, Lilla, and most of the others. "Who is it?" asked Dorf, his usually round eyes squinting. "Do you think it's from the Dark Prince?" I shrugged. It would make sense, though. The Draconis order stretched across all three kingdoms, of course, but the monastery sat squarely in Prince Vincent's middle kingdom. We were too close and too dangerous for him to leave alone for very long. There was a flash of color from the rider below, and I heard a sharp intake of breath from Lilla. I spun, dreading to see the shore-sided arrow of Lillapenna arcing ahead of me through the air, but I found that I was looking at something else entirely. The messenger was still riding, but he held out one hand, and in it he clutched a large cloth in the traditional colors of purple and green. "Don't shoot the messenger," I said urgently. "Those are Torvald colors."